Wright with the North Carolina Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. And today we're in the Court of Appeals courtroom in Raleigh, and we're going to do another in our series of the historical video series. Today we're very fortunate to have one of North Carolina's most outstanding lawyers, judges, friends, the Honorable Gerald Arnold. And we're here to talk about his outstanding career and to also talk about the work he did to rejuvenate this beautiful courtroom that we're in today. Gerald, it's wonderful to be with you this morning. I thank you for taking some time.
Honored to be with you, Mel, and especially glad to be back here in this courtroom. I spent a few hours here.
Yes, you spent many hours here. But tell us a little bit about your background. You've had a terrific career in North Carolina.
Well, I have been blessed professionally and in my personal life. I grew up on a tobacco farm not too far from here, down in Harnett County, and I went to the public schools there in Harnett County. I did go to Oak Ridge Military Institute and finished my schooling there before I went then to East Carolina College. And from East Carolina, I like to tell people that the NC State people here in Raleigh seem to get a kick out of it. I say to them, I received an education at East Carolina. I merely studied law at Chapel Hill. But I moved on from East Carolina to Chapel Hill to UNC Law School, and that's where I graduated from law.
And when did you finish law school?
Finished law school in 1966.
Okay. And tell us what you did after you finished law school.
Went back to Lillington, and my good friend Robert Morgan, who was in the state senate at the time, had a law firm there, and he was generous enough to give me a job. I have often wondered why at the time, but so I started practicing with Senator Morgan and then stayed there for a number of years.
Well, at some point while you were in practice with Senator Morgan, you decided you'd run for the North Carolina legislature.
That was something I had never planned on. I got involved, as young lawyers did at that time, in what we like to call public affairs, community affairs, church, Rotary Club. There was a fellow by the name of Bob Suits, who was an ecologist. I'd never heard of science of ecology at that time, but he taught over at Campbell. And he was interested in the Raven Rock area down on the Cape Fear River and the interesting things about that. And he thought it ought to be a state park. And so he got me to help him, and we put together a committee of people who were interested in that outcropping of rocks and the botanical growth and so forth there on both sides of the river. Something I think we called it the Raven Rock Preservation and Park Committee. And from that project, we came to the state legislature, and after some difficulty, we were successful in getting that state park created. And some of my friends suggested that I should run for the legislature. So according to the News and Observer, I was the first person who ran in North Carolina on an environmentalist platform. And it was brand new at the time. It was not even a pejorative, the way some folks speak of it today, but it was not something that just sort of happened.
And so you were in the legislature for 2 terms,
yeah,
71 and 73.
Yeah, and we did the higher education reorganization. Bob Scott was governor at that time, and then later on the reorganization of state government as well. It came partially under Governor Holtzhausen, who was the next governor.
And in addition to your time in the legislature, you still were in the law practice.
I was.
Okay.
And that was not so difficult back then because Lillington was not that far from Raleigh. I could drive to Raleigh, get back to Lillington, and it was not the full-time job that perhaps it became later on.
And it seems that we're seeing fewer and fewer lawyers in the legislature today.
No question about it. I don't remember. It would be easy to check, but when I was in the legislature, I am quite sure that a majority of us who were members were lawyers. A majority of us.
And that is not the case today.
Not the case today. And remember, Mel, we didn't have staff at that time. Now, the Attorney General's office would send over some lawyers to help with drafting and so forth sometimes, but for the most part, there were enough lawyers around on any given committee that we kind of took care of the drafting and all the things now that there are staff to do.
Right. After your terms in the legislature, I believe you came to the Court of Appeals.
I came to the court.
Tell us about that.
Well, of course, this court was very new at that time, and there was an opportunity for me to come to this court, and I was not one of the original judges. A lot of people thought because I was close on the hills, but there was an opportunity to come to this court, and I chose to do that, and enjoyed it more than I ever dreamed that I would.
And you were chief judge here at the Court of Appeals for what period?
I became chief judge in 1993. Chief Justice Exum named me chief judge. I had worked up from, again, this court also was without staff, and I started out, of course, and for many years I was the junior member of this court. So I had the responsibility of working up the petitions and motions and so forth, and I would present those to the senior judges, which was a great learning experience for me. To be honest with you, I came to this court. Of course, I suppose a lot of judges could say the same thing, but in so many ways, I just was not at all qualified, but you learned on the job. And it was a new court. We were doing a lot of, there was no pattern. And so it was a great experience.
And like so many things in the legal field, there's been a great deal of change from when you first started at the Court of Appeals to what happens now.
No doubt about that. It has changed from A to Z.
Right. And I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about this courtroom in a minute, but I'd like to go a little bit further to the point when you left the court. Do you remember when that was?
I did. I left the court in May, I think, of 1998, and I went with Lawyers Mutual Liability Insurance Company of North Carolina. Lawyers Mutual, as you know, being a insurer of lawyers for liability for lawyers, legal malpractice coverage.
Yes.
And that was a great opportunity for me too. I had always enjoyed and wanted to work in my day what we knew as public service. And I saw working for the lawyers, serving lawyers, in some ways as a continuation of that idea of public service, although it was not at all the same. And it was a great opportunity for me to get into the insurance industry, about which I knew very little. The insurance industry is quite a lot about the reinsurance industry at that level. And that was a great opportunity for me, and it was something very new and I enjoyed that. And of course, I enjoyed the relationship and engaging with the lawyers all across the state, as I had been doing.
Sure. But a big part of that also, from my perspective, was that you were part of training lawyers in how to do things the right way.
Yes.
You encouraged them to, so that they would not need your services as a liability company, but helping them with CLE programs and conventions and things to further help.
That was a big part of what we did, and Lawyers Mutual did it, I might say, very, very well. We had some of the top legal talent in this state,
yes,
to help us.
And then at some point when you were there, I believe you ventured over to help with AOC for a little while, the Administrative Office of the Courts.
Well, I did. I came back. I took a leave from Lawyers Mutual and came over. Chief Justice Mitchell was Chief Justice at that time, Burley Mitchell, whom I had known since I can't remember when I didn't know him, and a great Chief Justice for this state, as you know. And I served a while as Director of the Administrative Office of the Courts. And of course, I had been on the court here at the Court of Appeals for so long and had worked so closely with AOC, and knew a lot about it. But I suspect primarily my responsibility and why he wanted me, the legislature was in session, and that's always funding for the courts. It's always, having been a member, and there were still members with whom I had served, believe it or not, there, and that was helpful.
Sure.
And being a former member, I had certain privileges maybe that was a help to me.
And you've always been somebody that people would turn to for help and assistance in your experiences. I believe I saw that President Carter tried to appoint you as a federal judge at some point for the Eastern District. And also you were asked to head up the SBI at some point. So throughout your career, people have turned to you for help and assistance in many things involved in the legal field. One of the other things that I think of when I think of you is not just your intelligence, your experience, your knowledge, but your storytelling. As you think about your career, and you think about the people that helped you get started in your career as a practicing lawyer and as somebody who's been involved in so many things, we're going to have a lot of young lawyers look at this at some point. Is there any particular story that sticks out in your mind that you'd like to share with them?
Well, Bill, I'm sure I could come up with some. As you know, storytelling, back when I started, sort of went along with being a lawyer. And then in the political activities that I was fortunate enough to engage in, always people who enjoyed the political stories, and I certainly enjoyed them, and I was fortunate to work with so many wonderful people. I think about former Treasurer Mr. Edwin Gill, for whom I was fortunate to drive. Mr. Gill never had a driver's license, and he lived at the Sir Walter Hotel. Wow. And so I would pick him up, and I was not the only person, but I learned so much from him, and some of the stories that I can remember with Mr. Gill, and then of course serving in the legislature. I remember a very prominent member of the legislature on one occasion paid me a compliment, and it went like this. He had tried to get me to vote for his bill. Well, I was not inclined to do it. I had, to be honest with you, I didn't have any strong feelings one way or the other about it, but I had given my word that I would vote in opposition to that bill. Now, the bill carried, overwhelmingly, but I voted against it. And Mr. Ramsey came over to me and patted me on the back. He sat right across the aisle there, and he said, "Well, Arnold, I'll say this for you. You start wrong, but you stay wrong." But it was a compliment.
I think he meant it that way. Yeah. You have a lovely wife.
I do.
Tell me about her and your family.
Well, Sue, she came from Lillington, and she was certainly one of the brightest and prettiest girls in Lillington, and why she ever took up any time with me is beyond me when I think about it. Somebody said she must have had a great sense of humor to have married Gerald. But she was, I admired her academic ability. She is a doctor of education, and Dr. Sue now. But we have 2 children. We will have been married 53 years, June the 26th, and still counting. So I figure I've made a good start.
Yes, you have. You certainly have. And congratulations on that. I would like for you to tell us a little bit about this courtroom.
This courtroom is a treasure for North Carolina. For so many years, I sat in this courtroom, and I guess I can say it now. I was paying close attention to the arguments now. I don't want you to think that I was daydreaming. But looking at the features of this courtroom, I knew that it was not the typical courtroom. It was more highly decorative. The plaster and the ornamental features of this courtroom sort of jump out at you now.
They do.
Of course, it was built back in 1913, and it has been repainted whatever paint the state had at the time, sometimes green, cream, white, and for the most part, and except for that cove ceiling that's overhead, which now has a kind of a copper color, that was painted a blue when the court sat here, when the Court of Appeals sat here. But I began to ramble around this building and go upstairs and climb overneath and so forth and learn something about it. But I didn't know very much about it. As luck would have it, a visitor came one day and called on me. It was from London. And it turned out he was with the company that there had been a fire. You may remember the Windsor Palace caught fire back in the 1990s. And the royal family had to vacate, and they had to do some work in there because of the damage with the fire. This chap was part of the company that did that work for the palace, but he wanted permission to look at the ceiling in this courtroom, and I said sure. So I came in the courtroom with him, and he explained to me that ceiling was very unusual in America, that there were many ceilings, more decorative and perhaps more beautiful to look at, more colorful, but the technique that was used had only been used 2-3 times here in America, and this probably was the best example of the technique, and it was some kind of Baroque, neoclassical this or that, and I don't remember too much about it, but he talked a lot about it and wanted to know if he could come back and bring some other people. And of course, I was happy to tell him he could. And he suggested that we needed to restore the features of this courtroom. And he explained to me that, and then I later on read a lot about it. It's that style of architecture that we call Beaux-Arts, loosely in English, fine arts school that started in Paris back in, I think, the 1700s. And that style of architecture became very popular in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Very ornamental, classical, neoclassical, meaning Greek and Roman, You know, we got our democracy from the Greeks. The law came from Rome primarily. So you find a lot of buildings in America, public buildings, libraries, Grand Central Station in New York, grand mansions, the Biltmore in Asheville, the Grove Park Inn, the hotel, and a lot of courthouses were built in that style of Beaux-Arts, which was, again, grand neoclassical style just for the sake of style in many instances. But this courtroom is somewhat extreme in that you find so many of the features that you find in these buildings, like Grand Central Station, or I think it's the Bancroft, the Naval Academy is entirely in the Beaux-Arts style. And so I learned something about that, and we were able to get it restored. My interest, I think I told you earlier, was not only preservation but conservation. And as a public building, sometimes we don't really look after our public buildings in North Carolina. There's nobody who's really assigned to do it. And when there's a leak or something, we paint it, we plaster it without giving much thought. Of course, you don't find many buildings as ornate as this building. And so consequently, there was water damage to the ceiling here in this courtroom. The way it is now, you see all these different rich colors. It was all painted one color. And from time to time, whatever paint the state was using that summer, that's the color it was painted.
Right. Well, now, did this gentleman who came to you to see the courtroom explain to you that he'd like to work on it? Did he bring people with him? How did that work?
Indeed, he did send someone back. He came back once or twice, but he sent someone from his company who was very helpful in helping me identify the kind of skilled people it took to restore this courtroom. And as I explained to them, it was to be a working courtroom, not a museum. We didn't want to have it just as a museum because it is still used even today. And I remember that, so it was not just a matter of getting somebody who could paint, somebody who was an artist, but those 3 panels that are over our heads in that ceiling, one had been water damaged pretty badly. One of these panels was pretty much intact. Another one had been damaged in some respect and had been repainted, but not by the kind of skilled artisans that later, who did what you see now. It's very difficult to know which was original and which has been redone. But there's a young fellow from Belgium came, and he had some other young guys with him. And of course they scaffolded in here, and some of that ceiling they took off just in the thinnest of layers of paint, put it back, redid it, repainted some of it. It was just amazing what was done. And of course they tested the paint. There's a term of science for it, but they scraped off the layers of paint, and the different colors were unbelievable to me. And of course they told me that's what we would find, so I was not surprised.
Sure.
That this style, they would not have gone to the trouble of doing all the ornamental sculpturing in this room and just painted it cream or white.
And how long a period of time was it approximately that
well,
they were
it
here?
was there were several years involved from the first visit, 4 years, 3 or 4 years. But I started with his help and started with a ceiling down in the entrance of this building first, and worked our way up to the courtroom here. and finally were able to get a company from New York and they helped us, and finally were able to do what we did. Probably a year that we had to hold court outside this building.
Right. Well, it is a marvelous, beautiful courtroom.
Well, it is, and I'm glad. And we don't have a lot of members of the general public come here to see this, but it is a real treasure of North Carolina, and people do come to see it. Of course, the attorneys and school children sometimes come,
sure,
but more people should come to see it.
Well, we are going to show this video, I'm sure, to a number of law students and young lawyers. I remember my first appearance at the Court of Appeals. You probably do as well.
I can tell you my first appearance in this court. They had not moved to this building.
Okay.
And it was the second day the court sat, and I argued before a panel of this court, Mallard and Campbell and Britt, and they sat in the Finance Committee room in the State Legislative Building.
I'll be darned. Well, I'm thinking back to the time when I came for my first appearance, and new lawyers come into this room and they are amazed because it's different from the courtrooms they've appeared in before. But for new lawyers coming to this court for perhaps their first time or first couple of times, what advice do you give young lawyers about appellate work and what you're looking for as a justice or judge on that bench?
Well, what I looked for was an appeal usually had one or two real questions in it that had to be resolved on which the case would turn. Now, lawyers like to throw everything but the kitchen sink in these briefs and questions, and of course you have to raise them to meet the procedural rules or you can't argue them. But think in terms of what is it about, if you're the appellant, why should this case be overturned? Why should it be sent back? What's wrong with it? And walk up to the court and look up at the court. Look at them. Don't look and speak into your notes. Just put your notes aside. I don't care how complicated it is. You know the case. And the young lawyers and old lawyers are scared to death. And I remember that feeling, for goodness sakes. But just look up at the bench and look at one of those judges or all of them and say, Judge, let me tell you why this case needs to go back. Here's what's wrong with it. And if I'm wrong about this, there's nothing wrong with the case, but I'm not wrong with it, and here's why. In sort of in that manner. Now, that would be persuasive to me. And of course, on the other side, presentation is quite the same way. A lot of lawyers, they've made brilliant arguments in the briefs, and as I used to tell them, counsel, don't you think I can read? I've read that. You don't have to go over it. But tell me in your own words. Now, somebody's got to write an opinion. Think about it. We want to say, here's a case that is going to be affirmed, and this is why. I don't want to write about, or the court doesn't want to write about, 16 different arguments or even 8. Let's boil this down to why should it be affirmed? Well, why is there no error? Now, we still may want to discuss all of these other issues, but think about what it really turns on.
Absolutely. Great advice for young lawyers. As long as we're talking about young lawyers, you are currently, and I appreciate it so much, a member of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. Professionalism has been very important to you, I know, throughout your career. For new lawyers, what would you say to them about the importance of professionalism?
There's nothing more important, nothing. You're going to, as a new lawyer, you're going to master the subject matter of what it is you're doing in your practice. But the professionalism is something that most lawyers have to sort of affect. They've got to learn it. You learn it from other lawyers. It's pretty easy on the one hand, and it's pretty hard on one hand too. There are very competing pressures out there on the culture itself. Is one problem. When I started practicing law, the bar was so small, and you dealt with lawyers, the older lawyers, the young lawyers learned from the older lawyers, but it basically comes down to this, in my mind, this concept of professionalism. Treat another lawyer the way you want that lawyer to treat you. It's kind of the old idea of the golden rule. And your mama taught you that. And it's true in your professional life as it is. It's about civility. And it starts with me. And heavens knows, sometimes, we have bad days and we're frustrated. But if I'm civil to you, Mel, there's a good chance you're going to be civil back to me. And so it starts with me, and it starts with you.
Wonderful. Well, Chief, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your career. I want to thank you for all you've meant to North Carolina and to me personally. And I look forward to being with you many times in the future, I hope.
Well, I hope so too, and I thank you for the opportunity, and I thank you that we've been such good friends for so long, and the example that you have set for so many people, and the work you do for the Professionalism Committee.
Thank you.